Sure, there are so many stories of mysterious creatures and sightings that have happened over the years, and as a kid, I was always really fascinated by them, and I mean, I still am, but I guess to get us started, man, I thought we could talk about your latest book on the Bishopville lizard man. Of all the cryptids, I think I'm more interested in stories of things that resemble like lizard or serpent type beings other than, say, ape-like creatures such as Sasquatch, maybe because they're just more rare. But give us a little history of the case. What went down in Bishopville, North Carolina?
Well, yeah, it's certainly one of those, you know, somewhat famous cryptozoology cases, and it's certainly intriguing that it involves something that people have dubbed the lizard man. You know, there's a long history of creatures like that, reported down through the ages, but they are definitely more rare. I mean, they're not like the sightings of Bigfoot where you hear about something every day. So it was an intriguing case from that point. Basically, to summarize the Bishopville lizard man case, around 1988, in the summer, people started reporting sightings of a creature living there. And Bishopville is in South Carolina, and the location was a place called Scape or Swamp, and it's just located kind of on the outskirts of Bishopville. Bishopville is a very small town in Lee County, and people began reporting seeing a creature that was around 7 feet tall. It was humanoid. It walked upright on two legs. Some said they thought it had a tail. Some said, they definitely did see a tail. And it was, said to have greenish or brown skin. Well, the sheriff department down there that summer of '88 got a phone call from some residents who live near Scape or Swamp, and they had gotten up and come outside and noticed that their car had been basically vandalized or literally chewed up by an animal. It appeared there was tracks and hair, and looks like some kind of a scuffle went down, and which was really strange. And the sheriff ended up going down there and looking into it, and he wasn't quite sure what to make of it. But as they were investigating this, some of the locals came up and said, well, it could be the lizard man. And the sheriff's like, the what? The lizard man. We've had some people around here that have seen a strange creature in the swamp, and we call it the lizard man. So that was the first the sheriff's office had heard of this, and they were quite dubious, of course, but they said, well, something's going on here. So, if anybody has a sighting or information, you have them come talk to us. Nobody's in trouble. Just come talk to us. Well, it wasn't a couple of days later before a father brought his 17-year-old son into the sheriff's office, and the boy's name was Christopher Davis, and he had quite a story, which basically he said that he had a flat tire out near Scape or Swamp at about 2 a.m., and as he was just getting ready to put the tools away and take off, he saw something coming at him in the moonlight, and it was what he described as a red-eyed, green-skinned monster. It had long claws and three-fingered hands, and he basically scrambled to get in his car and drive off as this thing jumped on top and attempted to get in the car. And once they had seen the report come in the paper about the vandalized car, this guy, Christopher Davis's father, thought, well, better take my son down there and tell the sheriff, because it may have something to do with what's going on. And that's how it all got started. And, when you read cryptozoology books now, you often get a summary of the story. It's something that a lot of people know about. When it comes to lizard men, this was kind of one of the more famous cases because there was a lot of sensational details and, of course, an alleged attack on somebody. So, basically what I did was look more closely into the case. I went to Bishopville. I interviewed the sheriff, now retired, and some people, and just kind of put together the whole entire story, which has never really been told before.
Yeah, it sounds pretty crazy. I mean, this happened in, I think you said 88?
Mm-hmm.
When was the last sighting of the lizard man?
Well, there's been sightings in other places infrequently throughout, but really the case just sort of blew up and disappeared very quickly. So the last sighting was around 1991. So it was something that, was a short period of time and something we call a flap in these type of investigations, in which suddenly, there may be the presence of some sort of animal or a creature for several years, and then it simply, either moved on or disappeared or died or whatever the case may be. So it's not like this has continued a long time. So it was very mysterious.
Yeah, that seems to be in line with a lot of cryptid cases. They pop up like crazy for a short amount of time and then they go away. But I guess outside of this Christopher Davis account, were there any other like real detailed accounts of encounters with this lizard man that you found to be pretty compelling?
Yeah, there were several. And just to give a rough timeline, when the sheriff investigated that chewed up car, that happened several weeks before Christopher Davis had his encounter. And as the police started to look around and to try to ask people about this, a couple of guys came forward and said they had seen something down there even further back, like a year or two prior. One guy said it was evening and he was riding his bike up near Scape or Swamp, and there's this like artesian well where it just flows, and people go there and get a drink or whatever. He was standing there smoking a cigarette, and he saw some sort of a large creature standing on the other side of the road. At first he thought it was a dead tree, but then he realized it moved, and a car was coming, and at that point it sort of backed off into the woods. Another local resident who had a sighting about a year before that said he was constructing a hog pen down near the swamp and saw a really strange creature darting between the trees during the day. And then following Christopher Davis's, sighting, and then moving forward, then you did have other people who saw it in that same time period. In fact, an Air Force colonel saw it run across the road one night as he was returning home from a dinner. And, you would figure an Air Force colonel wouldn't just be spouting this off for no reason. I mean, he kept his name confidential. But I in going down to Bishopville, I talked to this retired sheriff, Liston Truesdale. I had access to all the police reports, the documents, everything that I could look over, and a tremendous amount of newspaper clippings, because it got a ton of media coverage at the time. So I kind of put the pieces together like that. And so there was about, 10 or 12 what I thought were fairly credible sightings or incidents that went on at that point to suggest that, there was something down there that people were seeing.
Wow, man, that is so crazy. I would love to see something like that. But were these people describing it as like more of an intelligent creature or more of like an animal?
Well, in Christopher Davis's case, it seemed very animal-like, and that was always the pinnacle encounter, because it jumped on the car and it displayed such aggressive tendencies. It was just wild. A lot of the other people just saw it, very briefly. It ran across the road, or darted between the trees, or it backed off into the tree line. So, there wasn't enough witness data to really decide if the thing had much intelligence or not. Which is another thing that kind of makes it intriguing, because it's always spookier when you're talking about something that could have intelligence. And of course, if it walks upright, it's, humanoid, your mind just starts to wonder. And now some of the later sightings in like 90 and 91, they were kind of different, because those people said, they got a good look at it, a creature in the headlights, and they said it resembled something like a Sasquatch. They thought it was brown and had hair on its body. So, which further kind of convolutes, trying to figure out what it is. But some of those were good sightings. I had the witness reports that were written down literally the next day by a family of 5 people that saw it very clearly. It lunged at the car as they drove by. So by all accounts, it's at least aggressive, but I can't say if it's intelligent.
Yeah, it's so ironic that it would be so aggressive and also so elusive. Kind of funny. It's like it doesn't want to be seen, but if you see it, it's going to try to kill you.
Yeah, it is strange. I mean, it just seems like for everything you start to try to, compose a hypothesis or a theory, there's some kind of a conflicting behavior, which just makes it tough. And then, I started to think, well, maybe there was, multiple animals that people saw. And of course, once a location like that, they have a creature like this associated with it, and the media gives it a name like the lizard man, it doesn't matter. I mean, you could be, the best example of a Sasquatch and walk right out in the middle of the road, you're going to be the lizard man.
Yeah.
I mean, and that was one thing I was trying to sort out. Just what were these people seeing? Was it, scaly? Was it reptilian, or was it a Bigfoot that was covered in algae or wet from the swamp? There's a lot of ways you can go with it. And of course, there's always the stories that my cousin was the lizard man. He dressed up in some elaborate costume and scared everybody, and things like that. But those kind of things don't account for the entire phenomenon. You can't rule out that maybe one of those was a hoax or something. I mean, just no way to know. But it's nothing that, when you start looking at all the pieces, it's nothing people could orchestrate. Like, I'm going to set out to create this monster, and it's not that much.
And fuck up people's cars in the process.
Right.
That's taking the joke kind of far.
Yeah, I mean, your criminal behavior, jumping at cars is endangering your life. And if it would have been a consistent costume, if it was one costume, I think people would have had a more consistent description of the thing.
True.
But the descriptions were somewhat varied, which led me to believe that it wasn't, necessarily somebody with an elaborate costume that they would have used over and over and over, and everybody would have just said, yeah, it's definitely green and it, whatever.
So did they find any physical evidence at all, any tracks or anything from this creature?
Yeah, there were some tracks found. One of the more famous trackways that was found was right in around that time. It wasn't long after Christopher Davis had his encounter. The police were actually patrolling down there because a woman called and said she had been hearing some extremely strange animal noises coming from the swamp. So the police were driving on the dirt roads down there looking around. And as they went kind of to a dead end, turned around and came back, they could see in the headlights there was a string of tracks that came out of the trees and walked along the road for a certain distance, which hadn't been there before. So whoever made them literally walked across the road as the cops were down at the other end of the road. And so those tracks, and I explain it in more detail in my book, and they've kind of been highlighted on several shows like Destination Truth, Mysteries at the Museum did a segment on these tracks, but to me they look rather hokey, and I don't believe that they were necessarily connected to the animal. I think somebody in this case was having some shenanigans, but the police certainly tried to look at all this stuff fairly seriously because they weren't sure there was a so-called monster connected to all this. But when you got people reporting, aggressive behavior, Christopher Davis said it jumped on the car, you got damaged vehicles, they wanted to figure out what it was. And if it would have been something, even if it would have been a bear, if they didn't look into it and somebody got hurt, everybody would have said, why didn't you, follow up? So they kind of had their hands tied. But, they cast these tracks, and they still have, you can still look at these plaster casts if you go down to Bishopville today. But in my research, I did find some other folks that had found tracks that weren't famous or never got in the paper, but they seemed a lot more credible and a lot more mysterious. And these tracks generally had 3 toes, which was kind of something that always associated with these swampy monsters, it seems.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. So you said you interviewed the sheriff. Were you able to interview this Christopher Davis at all?
No, unfortunately not, because he's no longer alive. He was actually shot and killed in his home in 2009.
Oh, that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it is. There's actually some. I have a sort of a small chapter at the end of my book called "Curse of the Lizard Man," and as I researched, looking for a lot of these witnesses, or putting together the story, I realized that several of them had died in very strange circumstances or violent ways, and violent accidents. So it was kind of weird. So Christopher Davis, of course, being the most dramatic, being shot. Another one of the young men that had witnessed it was killed in a car accident in 1999. Things like that. So another mysterious shroud upon the Bishopville Lizard Man case.
Yeah, that's pretty trippy. I mean, it seems like a lot of time went by between their death and the actual sighting, but maybe the Men in Black were trying to clean up the mess for some people who've seen some stuff they shouldn't have seen.
Well, that's it. Men in Black always come into play in these things, of course, but unfortunately, Christopher Davis they did catch the two guys who shot him, and he was just your average kid in high school when he had this encounter. But I kind of started realizing that his association with the Lizard Man may have been very detrimental to his mental health later, because he got a lot of newspaper coverage, a lot of interviews. He was even interviewed to be on the Oprah Winfrey show. It never happened. I mean, it's nuts. And I mean,
yeah.
CBS Evening News came down there. Good Morning America did a live broadcast from the swamp. It was just huge coverage. And Christopher Davis was always being interviewed. And then really forevermore, he was just known as the guy who saw the Lizard Man. And you can only imagine how much, ribbing and mockery and teasing he got from then on. And so he kind of descended into some bad stuff, got into drugs, and just didn't turn out like his parents. His parents were good folks, worked at some reputable places in town, and he moved away and never really went quite right, and then ended up getting murdered.
Wow. Man, yeah, that sounds like a curse to me. Talk about one day your life's just normal. The next day you see one little thing and you're thrown off your trajectory into some crazy mess you never planned to get into. Yeah. So, yeah. Man, it sounds so interesting. I know you've done a lot of writing in this field, but for a book, out of all the choices, why this particular case?
Well, after I'd written my previous book, The Beast of Boggy Creek, and that was quite successful, and people, liked it. And so I thought, okay, well, I gotta, what am I going to do next? And I've always kind of been drawn to the swamp monsters and things. So I went on what I called a swamp tour. I went around the Southeast, going to various swamp areas that had reports of strange animals, like Honey Island Swamp, Okefenokee in Georgia, and I went to Scape Swamp in Bishopville. And so I was thinking I was going to do maybe more of a general book on swamp monsters or something like that. But once I got to Bishopville and started looking into the case, I realized there was more to it than I ever realized, more than you read in the books. And, I saw a lot of inaccuracies that had been written, and, God forbid people look on Wikipedia or whatever. It's just, this is all wrong. But I thought this case was very compelling because I did have the sheriff there to interview. I did have access to all the police files that they had taken, and his story is quite interesting. Just here you got this small town sheriff who was just like Christopher Davis, suddenly drug into this whole Lizard Man thing. And so I thought that this just had a good story to it. While there's not a whole bunch of sightings and all that, there were a lot of connected incidents that were cool. Scape Swamp itself had an interesting history, and so I ended up thinking, man, this would be a great book, and like you, I kind of love that lizard reptilian tie-in or those kind of monsters. I'm a big fan of Creature from the Black Lagoon.
Yeah.
Movies like that. I thought, man, this is like a real life Creature from the Black Lagoon, man. This is like, you can't make this stuff up, you know.
Right, that's wild. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a fascinating case. The one thing that's disappointing about this, and really a lot of cryptid cases in general for me, is that anytime I hear about some interesting new case that I haven't heard about before, they're usually strings of sightings from the past. I mean, are there any lesser known cryptids that are being seen today to a large degree?
Lesser known cryptids. Well, I mean, specifically in these cases of reptilian humanoids, I mean, they are few and far between, but they do pop up, you know. And in my book, I have a chapter where I just kind of examine the past history of some of these type of things. You know, Thetis lake monster. You had a few reports in British Columbia near this lake where people had seen a reptilian humanoid creature. You have reports along the Ohio River where a woman was grabbed and by something under the water and tried to pull her down.
Oh my God!
So yeah, and something called the Loveland frog, which, you know, is pretty hokey, but I mean, nonetheless, it's a famous cryptozoology case, and in this case, it's almost like a bipedal amphibian creature, which is even weirder. So you just get these little bits and pieces of these sort of reptilian creatures popping up here and there in what I would consider a cryptozoological realm. I mean, if you start looking at, if you want to include UFO or alien reports, I mean,
right.
Obviously a lot of aliens take on that sort of reptilian, you know, facade. Mm-hmm. So, you know, but I try to keep this, you know, you got to draw some boundaries here. Let's talk about Bishopville. Let's talk about what we believe might be cryptids, you know. But lesser known cryptids, you know, that are seen and then pop up again, it's usually few and far between. I'm trying to think of stuff off my head, famous cases like Momo, the Missouri monster.
Yeah.
Or
I'm from Missouri, so I've definitely heard that one before.
Yeah, but, you know, that was mostly in the 70s, and, you know, it's not like, you know, another rash of sightings happens. It just sort of happened then. But, of course, if there's a Bigfoot sighting anywhere near there, or even in Missouri, people start associate it with Momo, you know. So it's not to say that Momo isn't still roaming out there. He just may not be in the, you know, right there near Louisiana, Missouri. Mm-hmm. If that's not a confusing town.
Yeah.
But yeah, well, where are we? Wait, Louisiana, which has, you know, another history of swamp monsters in where the Honey Island swamp is near New Orleans. Now, there's sightings of that creature that occur from time to time down there, but, you know, they're not always printed in the paper. And if you're a local and look into these things, you might know about them. But, you know, they don't always make it into the newspaper. So you sort of have to have your radar up and get a good connection with other researchers. For example, if I wanted to find out recent sightings of the Honey Island swamp monster, you know, I may need to contact somebody who lives in the area.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I'm not going to find these necessarily on CNN.
True.
You know.
Although that would be a way more interesting news program. I wish it was like that. But
oh yeah, well, all they like to cover is the Bigfoot hoaxes whenever they do anything.
Right.
So it's they don't even get it right when they do.
So I mean, you brought up Missouri, and it's funny because, you know, I used to look up cryptids that were found in Missouri, and probably the most interesting one I heard about was this creature known as the Ozark howler, which was described like a big black panther with horns that made like crazy howling noises. And that has stuck with me for a long time. I've been looking out for that one on the side of the highway. Are you familiar with that at all?
Yes, yeah, Ozark howler. It's definitely got one of the coolest cryptid names, I think. Yeah, and there's, you know, that's an interesting one. And, you know, there's others. If you start looking around in other states, I mean, you'll see, you know, the wampus cat and some things like that are almost these sort of black panthers, but a little more monstrous. So there are, you know, similar animals reported all over, and certainly the Ozark howler, you know, some of those kind of bridge between what I would call folklore and cryptozoology, but it doesn't rule out that somebody perhaps did see a black panther or something, and maybe they thought it had horns, but it doesn't mean that there's no real animal associated with it. There certainly could be, and it's hard to say just how monstrous the thing is, but
it is. Are you under the impression that there is a paranormal or supernatural element to these? It seems like you're more inclined to think they're just rare, unknown animals.
Well, I kind of start with that theory, when I got started in Bigfoot research and so forth, and I kind of go in with the idea that it's an undocumented primate. But I think the more you deal with these kind of cryptids, and of course if you start looking into cases like lizard men and things, I don't know. I try to keep an open mind. I can't say for sure if they have supernatural qualities or not, or they're, they certainly all fall under paranormal because they don't seem to be defined by what we know to be normal animals.
True.
But, do they shapeshift, or do they, materialize or disappear? I can't say for sure, but I'm cool with anybody's theories on these, because until we have an animal laying on a lab table, we can't really say who's right or wrong, and I don't, don't pretend to know things that I just, that I don't have any way of knowing. So until then, I'm open-minded about it, and it's possible that, some of these creatures could be, have traits that we don't understand yet. Who knows? And that might explain why we see them occasionally and we cannot catch one.
Yeah, I definitely have no idea, but a lot of times these things are reported to have glowing red eyes, and they're so elusive and they avoid capture. So it makes me think there's something weirder about them. But also the fact that we alluded to earlier is that they're usually just one creature, or maybe very few creatures, seen in one specific area for over the course of a couple of years, and then they're gone. It's not like we uncover a family or carcasses or anything like that, except, not that we've uncovered a lot of Bigfoot carcasses, but that's the one case where I do think it's pretty clear that there is some type of primate that has lived with humanity throughout the years and has avoided real contact. That case is pretty clear, but all the other ones, they're very out there, and we have not much to go on other than people's word that they saw something.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And the further you get away from Bigfoot, the more sketchy the evidence is. And, it just seems like a lone creature, which unfortunately doesn't bode well, because it almost now does seem more folklore, because in natural animals, you typically, at least sometimes, see them in groups or families, or here's the baby howler cubs with the mama or whatever. So yeah, it doesn't bode well, but it of course doesn't rule out the fact that if you were lucky enough to see one, you didn't get to see the whole family, because the sightings are rare. But I kind of approach all of these things from two standpoints, as kind of from a cryptozoological angle, where I'm interested in determining whether there's some real animal behind, these stories or sightings. And at the same time, they're just cool, spooky stories. And in my books, I just tell the story. I can't prove or disprove them or anything, but no matter what it is, man, it makes great stories, and it's spooky and it's cool. And, for people that are into mysteries or monsters or whatever, it's got an appeal. And that's kind of where I try to approach it, because I like the subject. And hey, if they turn out to be real and we can get one to examine, even better.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, what are a couple of your favorite cryptozoology creatures or accounts that you've heard that we might not have talked about yet?
Well, my utmost favorite would be the Fouke monster, the beast of Boggy Creek, that I dedicated my first book to, and that all stemmed really from me seeing a movie called The Legend of Boggy Creek sometime back in the 70s. And it, it sort of made that creature very famous. Now, you do have other, places where regional Bigfoot type creatures are seen, but this one was especially famous because of the legend of Boggy Creek. And that all took place in southwestern Arkansas, just across the border here from Texas, where I live. When I saw that as a kid, I mean, it just cemented, my fascination with this, because that creature, it was a Bigfoot-like creature, but it just seemed spookier. It's, more aggressive. It was hairy. It was attacking people. So that's always been my favorite. And when I got when I wrote the book on the subject, I ended up finding out that so many people loved that movie, Legend Boggy Creek, and were also fascinated by it. So I think that's one reason I was so successful with the book, because other people loved that story. I dug out so much more stuff that had never been known before. But so that's one of my favorites. Let's see, what are some of my other favorites? I like the lake monsters.
Yeah,
I think
me too.
Champ is a cool one, and for almost every body of water, you can almost dig up a few tales of strange sightings. One in particular that I would call a lesser known cryptid that I'm just fascinated with is one called Morag, and it's sighted in Scotland in Lake Morar, in Loch Morar. Now, of course, the Loch Ness creature is far more famous. And most people don't realize that a short distance away in Loch Morar, there are also a long history of sightings of a very similar and strange creature. And I've always been fascinated with that, because, these are sort of things that, the Loch Ness Monster is going to make the newspaper, but nobody puts the Morag in there. But the are no less compelling and mysterious, as Nessie. So the Morag is definitely one that's intriguing to me. I'm drawn to the Mothman case.
Yeah, it's popular too.
Mothman is it's a cool concept. Now, of course, that who knows, that almost bridges into more of the paranormal than just some cryptozoological creature. But nonetheless, great story, cool cryptid.
Let me ask you about, on the subject of these lake creatures, one that I had heard about that I thought was pretty interesting, because I was actually there recently, was a Loch Ness Monster type creature in Lake Tahoe. And when I got home, I looked this up, and one thing that was interesting was apparently Jacques Cousteau at some point had a submarine expedition in Lake Tahoe, and when they asked him what he saw, he said, "The world is not ready for what's down there." And nobody really knows what that meant. It could have meant that he saw this strange creature, or some people have also suggested that the mob used to tie cement around, or, put people's feet in cement and throw them in Lake Tahoe, and maybe the whole bottom is just littered with human bodies. Who knows what he saw? But a lot of people have suggested that maybe he saw that Loch Ness Monster creature there.
Yeah, that I like that story too. That creature is known as Tahoe Tessie, and everything's got to relate to Nessie somehow. So everyone wants their own Nessie, but Tahoe Tessie, that's totally cool. And yeah, that's always been kind of a spooky thing that Jacques Cousteau had said that. And of course, if you look back in the history of Lake Tahoe, you will find that the Native Americans had tales of some sort of creature living, there in the lake. So it, wasn't just like it popped up in modern times. It was a historical reference. Now, I don't know, Jacques Cousteau, it almost seems like to me, if he had seen some unknown animal, I don't see how he could have let that go,
Yeah, good point.
To me, you know what I mean? He would be all over that. Seems like what his deal. Now, if he had seen a bunch of bodies and where mobsters had buried or whatever else, or thrown them in there, that he might have just left it alone.
Right. So, that's definitely probably the most likely situation. Yeah, I wouldn't want to turn that stone over and deal with the consequences if there were like 50 bodies down there. But man, another subject in the cryptid world that I really like is the idea of flying creatures. I mean, there's a lot of legends of the Thunderbird, which seems pretty interesting. You mentioned the Mothman, another type of winged creature. I've heard people talk about seeing what they describe as pterodactyl-like creatures. Are there any cases of like a flying creature that you think are really compelling?
Yeah, definitely. Well, one of my favorites along those lines is, like you say, the pterodactyl type creatures. And there's one called Kongamato, which has been reportedly seen near the Congo Basin in Western Africa. And, as a kid who, grew up, I loved dinosaurs and all that stuff. And of course, you're under the impression they're all dead until you come across these reports about creatures like Kongamato, in which people say they see a pterodactyl-like creature flying around. And the sightings of this go back to, I want to say, the early 1900s. But later, a famous scientist and cryptozoology researcher named Roy Mackal, who was a University of Chicago biologist, along with Ivan T. Sanderson, did expeditions into the jungles over there to, specifically search for Kongamato. And, they polled the natives and showed them pictures, and they would point to the pterodactyls and say, that's it, that's it. And,
wow.
They had, a sort of a brief sighting themselves of the creature. So I think Kongamato is, as far as pterodactyls, that's one of the first and foremost. But there's also some cool things along those lines stateside. There was a case, the Houston Batman down here in Texas, people seeing some sort of strange flying humanoid creature, and more along the lines, I suppose, of Mothman as opposed to pterodactyls. And then in South Texas and in places like that, you do get these sort of Thunderbird sightings, and in which people see impossibly large birds. So those are definitely great cryptozoology cases, and hard to research because they're often out in the middles of nowhere, and these birds are obviously flying high in the sky. It's not like you can ambush them on the ground or set up a camera trap or something like you could for Bigfoot. You just, I think it's winning the lotto if you see one of these,
Yeah, man, those winged ones, those get me. Anything that looks dinosaur-like, I think that's kind of what I have a more interest in. The pterodactyl stuff, the plesiosaur, Loch Ness Monster stuff, even the lizard man. I don't know what it is, but they're definitely, when I think creepy monster, that's kind of more the realm I'm looking at.
Yeah, there was, in my lizard man book, I kind of look a little bit at reports of what I refer to as more actual lizard or dinosaur-like reptiles that were seen to walk on two legs, as opposed to the humanoid reptilian creatures like the Bishopville lizard man. I kind of analyzed everything just to kind of make sense of it. But there's been sightings out in places like Colorado, in which a woman said she saw what effectively sounded like a small dinosaur run up and jump over the car. I mean, and claimed to have seen a nest where there was some eggs and things like that. So unfortunately, again, it's just a story. I mean, if she hadn't had an egg or ran
you got to grab one of those eggs, lady.
I'm telling you, man, it's $1 million egg or $1 billion egg. But yeah, totally cool. And it's, to I don't know, to even give a small percentage of hope that there is some living dinosaur, is awesome. I mean, you got the coelacanth, and that is basically a living dinosaur. So, it can happen.
Yeah, man, I've always loved this stuff. I've always seeked an explanation, though. I'm not really satisfied with the idea that they're animals. Not that doesn't immediately become the first thing you should think of. You know, it seems like the path of least resistance to think they're undiscovered animals, but there's just too many of them. They seem to have these red glowing eyes, which could just be people's fear or reflection. And like we said, there's always only seems to be one of them for a short period of time. And I'm not much into magic, but sometimes I wonder if this is these are some type of things occultists are conjuring up without knowing. Especially in the case of Mothman, I've heard people talk about it like that.
Oh yeah. I think when you start getting into flying humanoids and things that, as far as dinosaurs, we know at least they existed. I mean, you know, they may not be here now, but a creature like that did exist. When you start talking about flying humanoids and getting into more of the Mothman or Houston Batman or whatever, now you're definitely dealing with something that is previously unknown at all. And just the mechanics of a human being able to fly, goes against scientific principles. I mean, let's look at Icarus and whatever humans have decided to try to fly. It doesn't work very well. And so, I think you've got to have open it up to a lot more theories in these cases than just some sort of an undiscovered animal. I mean, unless, people saw an owl or something that they somehow thought had human form, then we are dealing with something in those cases that's much more unknown and mysterious. Yeah.
Man, it is a broad and wide field and does get into some weird areas. But for the skeptics out there, I mean, we got to be honest. We don't have a lot of good pictures. We don't have any bodies of these things that have really been conclusive. So it makes it tough sometimes to prove these things exist. But when you consider all the research you've done on unknown creatures and these kind of cryptid things, outside of the witness testimonies, are there any cases that have left some kind of physical evidence or maybe injured someone or something that you find really compelling and really credible cases?
I mean, it's sketchy, the cases. I mean, and I've seen some Bigfoot tracks that I found quite compelling. In the case of the Fouke monster, a guy had taken a track in that area around 2004. It was a 5-toe track, and I found this guy to be extremely credible and extremely believable, and he just had this track casting in his house. It took me a while to track it down because I'd heard rumors that this girl had brought one to school and this and that. He was not trying to get fame or fortune or advertise this thing. And, so now at least to go with his story, I could look at, a hard piece of evidence. We can't say that it's certainly from a creature like the Fouke monster or southern Sasquatch, but at least it was better than just simply a story. So I've seen things like this. I've seen a few locks of hair that have come from, people who seem to have fairly credible stories, and the hair would end up being examined by very reputable science professionals and such. And they ended up saying, I don't know what it is. It's not human. It's not artificial. And I can't match it to any of the known species of animals who would live in the area. So, I've seen those hair samples with my own eyes. That, helps to, I guess, fuel the fire for me that maybe there is something behind these things. It comes up occasionally, but by and large, you're talking about stories and anecdotal evidence from people, and a lot of that can be super intriguing and incredible because of the backgrounds of the people and who's telling this, especially when I speak to them face to face, or several times over.
That was going to be my next question, is in terms of just a juicy story that you really liked that had maybe more detail than most other stories. Is there a specific encounter with a cryptid that just sticks out in your mind that you really like story-wise?
There's several. Man, boy, it's hard to pick just one because I have so many. Let me just highlight one from the Beast of Boggy Creek.
Cool.
because I'm extremely familiar with this and have interviewed two of the individuals involved. And just to give people a little background, The Legend of Boggy Creek, the movie came out in 1972, and a lot of the content of the movie was based upon reports that had happened in the 60s and 70s. Now, the reports go back further than that, and most people think, oh, well, that all happened in the 70s and that was it. However, I found that people have still been citing a strange ape-like creature in the area up until today. So I found a witness who said he had a strange encounter in 1981. And so by 1981, if you lived in this area, you had heard of the legend of Boggy Creek. You knew what the Fouke monster was. You know, it was something you maybe didn't think about on a daily basis, but it was certainly in the back of your mind if you were in the woods and something happened. So, you had a little bit of, precedence for what was going on. But this kid, he wasn't, one that particularly believed in it or didn't believe in it. He just, he didn't know. He just was being a kid. And he was down one evening fishing on his pond. And he had been down there for a little bit and nothing much going on. He wasn't getting many bites. And he'd heard something rustling through the leaves. It was February. So there was a lot of leaf litter, and you could hear things moving around. He heard some kind of strange noises, but he thought, I think that's the neighbor's bull, because the neighbor had a big old bull that roamed on his property over there nearby. Mm-hmm. So it was starting to get dark, and he thought, man, I'm just going to whip around this other little nook in the pond. It was a little dog leg, and he thought, I'll just kind of, go over here. I'll try a few more minutes. If I don't get anything, I'm going to head back. So obviously he's on the pond. He's very quiet this way. And he kind of slowly rowed over there so he wouldn't disturb the fish. And as he gets around to the other side, he suddenly hears something walking. And he looks up and he sees literally within about 60 feet from him, he just caught a glimpse of a creature walking, and the thing was upright. It was, he said it was about his size, and this kid's tall. He's about over 6 feet. He said this thing was probably 6.5, 7 feet tall. Wow. It was covered in brown hair. It was walking fairly upright, had long arms that were sort of swinging, and the thing did not see him. And because he had been quiet, he was sitting there for a while, and he was on the pond, the thing just simply just was walking by and just didn't see him. And so he caught the side view and the back. And of course, he sees this, and immediately he's thinking, oh my God, this is the Fouke monster. I can't even believe it, And he's on his own property. This is a fenced-in property. I've been to the place. This is not a place where other people walk. It's not open to the public. The neighbors are, far enough away. Nobody should be walking out there. But he was quite certain it wasn't a person. It appeared ape-like. So he'd walked up a little embankment and walked down and disappeared, and he could hear it still walking. And of course now he's just literally shaking. So he paddles over to the edge, and he kind of fumbles out of the boat and gets on the edge, and he continues to listen, and suddenly this thing stopped walking. And keep in mind it's evening, the sun is dropping, and he's standing there waiting to see what happens, and then he heard this thing start running. And at that point, he just took off running to his house, which is about half a mile away. Ran all the way up, to the house, and he got there and was just extremely upset. His father, whom I have also interviewed, is a very upstanding citizen in Fouke. He is, a deacon in the church. He's been a photographer there for years, documenting the history of the area. Just a great guy. Well, his father came driving up, and he said, he sees Terry kind of in tears. He's like, Terry, what happened? What's going on? He said, Dad, I think I saw the Fouke monster. Wow. So his father, Lloyd, says, what? And he tells him what happened. So they ended up, he said, well, let's go down there and see if we can find any evidence. And Terry, the witness, didn't really like that idea, but Dad gave him the 357 and said, man, we got to go look. So they went down there. It was after dark, and they were looking around, and they could still smell sort of a skunky odor in the air. Couldn't find any footprints. It was leaf litter and all, but basically, this story was one that I researched, and this wasn't somebody who ran to the newspaper. Several locals knew about his sighting, but it was just something that happened to this kid, and that was it. And so once I interviewed both the father and the son, I felt, as close as I could to 100% certain that this kid had seen something unexplainable. He saw it very close, and knew what he saw. And it's creepy and fascinating all at the same time.
Yeah, that is. Man, well, we're getting kind of close to the end of the show. I wanted to ask you, if I got a lot of free time, so if I today wanted to go on an excursion, to go out and hunt something down, just to get a good picture, there's some smoking gun evidence, where would you send me if I consulted you for your expertise? Within the States, is there a certain spot where things are happening now, a hot spot for these type of creatures in 2014?
There's definitely several hot spots, I'd say. And you could be more specific to your region depending on where you are. You could definitely, locate some areas where there's been sightings of various creatures of all sorts.
For example, how about Southern California? Because I hear a lot about the swamps. I hear a lot about Northern California. What would you send me out looking for in the general Southwest area?
General Southwest. So lately, I don't know, a year or not too long ago, there was some sightings down there of these huge canine creatures that people thought were not coyotes. They weren't even really described as chupacabra, but certainly chupacabra sightings of these sort of mangy four-legged animals have been seen more increasingly across the Southwest. So if you were in that area, you could find some areas where there have been sort of large dog sightings or chupacabra sightings. That would be something I would say out there. And I guess, let's see, Lake Tahoe, I guess that'd be in the region, wouldn't it?
Yeah, kind of.
Reasonably close. Sometimes you're going to have to travel, but people ask me that same kind of thing. They'll email or something. Hey, I live here. Do you know any cryptids out here? And, I either do, or it doesn't take me long to whip up a couple of examples. So it's almost just wherever you are. If you, employ the great tool of Google, you could find some weird stuff going on in your area, even if that's not even cryptids. There's strange lights. There's all kinds of weird phenomenon going on. If people are into this sort of thing, just do a little research for your area, and you can quickly come up with a prospective spot to go have yourself a little adventure. And who knows, you may be one of those lucky ones that has an experience like this guy, Terry Sutton, I was talking about a minute ago. You may get more than you bargained for.
Yeah, hopefully you live to tell about it and you don't get cursed. But
exactly, yeah, you got to look.
Especially in this age where everybody's got a camera on them all the time, we're getting to that point where something's got to happen.
Yeah, technology is certainly catching up a bit to these cryptids. So.
Well, man, it has been a great time talking to you. Do you have any plans for what you're going to be going after next? Any plans for your next big cryptid book?
I've been kind of rolling over several ideas and doing some research. I may actually write a part 2 to my Boggy Creek book that expands the focus on the more general southern areas for ape-like creatures, and I've just compiled so many reports and talked to witnesses about this and that I'm trying to come up with the next book. My books have been fairly successful, so the pressure continues to where I've really got to get something good here to go forward and write a really good book, because I don't want to just rehash the same old stuff. I'm going to provide some new and interesting perspectives, or at least new reports and personal experience. So not totally sure where I'm going next, but I can say it will be cool.
Yeah, undoubtedly. Well, hey, it's been awesome. Do you want to give people your website also before we call it in?